Today we're going to study labor markets. And labor markets, for the most part, can be analyzed in terms of supply and demand, just like any other market we might have studied in units 1 to 4. But we single out labor markets today and in another unit about 2 weeks from now, because labor markets are particularly important to people's welfare. Labor markets are basically a code word for jobs. They're the job market, and they're heavily regulated. So, because people, jobs are so important to their life. So we're going to single out labor markets and study them in particular detail, because this is considered probably the most important market that we can use our tools from Ec 10 to study. So, first we need to generate a labor demand curve. We want to think back to the notion of marginal product from our study of production functions. And there's a marginal product of labor. So suppose this McDonald's is thinking about how many people to hire, and it can sell 10 burgers with one person on staff for the hour, or it could sell 15 burgers because it can get them cooked faster and satisfy customers more with 2 people. Then the marginal product of that second worker is going to be the 2 burgers. But that doesn't really help us in terms of how much should we pay that worker, or how much would we be willing to pay that worker, because we need to know how much the burgers are worth. So if the marginal product of labor is 5 burgers, and we sell those burgers for $2 each, so 5 burgers times $2 a burg, then we can see that the marginal revenue product, the MRP, of that worker is $10. They helped us make 5 extra burgers, we sold them for $2 each, so we have a $10 increase in revenue. And since we're going to assume that all of these firms are relatively small compared to the job market as a whole, they're going to be price takers. So they just look and see how much they'd have to pay the worker, maybe $8 an hour. They compare that to the marginal revenue product, $10, and then they're willing to demand that worker to work for 1 hour. So we end up seeing a demand curve. The labor demand curve is the marginal revenue product curve. So we just add up the marginal revenue product for a whole bunch of firms, and we get a market-wide marginal revenue product, or we get a market-wide labor demand curve that reflects the marginal revenue product of the firms. Next, we need to determine the supply of labor. As you can guess, it'll probably slope upward. The idea is that if we offer a low wage, say $6 an hour, probably nobody in our class is going to want to work. Because they have better things to do with their time. The opportunity cost of their time is worth more than $6. But somebody will probably do the work. My brother works at Walmart, so he'd probably be willing to work at McDonald's for $6 an hour. So we get a little bit of labor supplied when we have a low wage. But if we increase the wage to, say, $20 an hour, this is about how much you'd make per hour if you worked on Wall Street as a first-year analyst. So now I probably get most of the classes willing to work for $20 an hour. And if we raise the wage up to $100 an hour, then probably we'd get half the city to apply for that job. So now this curve looks like a straight line because the scale is extremely distorted, but the point is that the labor supply curve will, generally speaking, slope upward. If you pay people more, you'll get more people to apply, and those people will be willing to work for more hours per day. So now we can put the labor demand and labor supply curves together. I want you to do this because it's good practice to cement your understanding and work 2 problems on comparative statics. First, figure out what's going to happen to the equilibrium amount of labor, the employment, and to the equilibrium wage if a lot of immigrants move to the U.S. How's that going to influence labor demand and labor supply? And then second, do another graph where we ask what will happen to the equilibrium employment and wage if the price of hamburgers goes up. So focus on the market for fast food workers. So pause the video, draw your 2 graphs, and we'll go over those on the next slide. Alright, so in the first case, if a lot of immigrants move to the U.S., then the supply of labor is going to shift out. There's going to be a lot more people willing to work, so we're going to be adding up a lot more individual supply curves, and we get lower wages and more people employed. In the second case, If the price of all those burgers we're selling goes up, even if the marginal product of labor stays the same, the marginal revenue product will go up, so we'll see higher wages and more people employed. There's two other factor markets that we also theoretically work into this unit and are discussed in the book. They're the market for land and capital. And the reason we discuss land and capital together with labor is that unlike most other markets, it's firms who are demanding the inputs. Firms have to rent buildings so that they can produce. Firms have to rent capital so that they can, build things in their factories, bake pizzas in ovens, and firms are the ones who are paying and demanding the labor. And the supply in the labor market is produced by workers or people that sometimes you'd think of them as consumers and the firms as producers, but here it's flipped. So a question that I want to ask is, do you think the supply of land is very inelastic or elastic? How would the amount of land available to use for firms respond to the price? So the answer is, it's generally speaking very inelastic. There's a fixed quantity of land for the most part, so it doesn't respond very much to the price. You can actually build more land by dumping dirt into the water. So the Back Bay, for instance, the part of Boston that's on the other side of the Harvard Bridge, used to all be underwater, and they dumped a bunch of dirt in the river until they had more land. But for the most part, it's hard to create new land. The other way you can make more space or land is by building taller buildings. It creates more floor space, but that is also expensive. It's very expensive to build skyscrapers. So here's our two review questions. First, define the marginal revenue product of labor. Do it both with an equation and in intuitive terms, and then explain how it helps to determine the demand for labor. Second, is it a comparative statics exercise? I want you to think about how does a wage subsidy, so that's a subsidy to workers, if they work they get paid more by the government. How will a wage subsidy influence employment? Also you can label the PC and PP on that graph, so how will it influence the wage that the suppliers of labor receive, and how will it influence the wage that the producers have to pay?